All right, everybody. I think we're going to get started. For those of you who I haven't had a chance to meet in the past, my name is Dan Schnurr, and I am the director of the Jess Unruh Institute of Politics here at USC. And we co-sponsor this lunch series every Wednesday, 11:30 food, 12 to 1 conversation with our friends at the Bedrosian Center over in the Price School for Public Policy and the Center for Communications Leadership over at Annenberg. Normally, one of the three of us or one of our colleagues will moderate the discussion each week, and we'll moderate a panel discussion of faculty experts, off-campus political or policy experts, and student experts. But at the end of last semester, at the end of the spring term, we tried an experiment. And that was, instead of having one of us as moderators, instead to have student moderators asking us questions. And we all like that a lot, of course, because when you ask a question, you only get a minute or two to talk. But when you're answering a question, you can just talk and talk and talk for as long as you want. And Raphael, in particular, was particularly excited about that prospect.
You got to watch out for me, exactly.
Exactly. So I'm going to turn this over to our student moderators in just a minute, but just to begin with, I wanted, on behalf of the Bedrosian Center and on behalf of the Center for Communications Leadership, to thank all of you for coming and hope that you'll join us throughout the semester. Next week, we'll go back to our usual format, but this week we're going to start with our student moderators. So please join me in welcoming Aaron Taxi, who is the president of the USC College Democrats, and Maddie Lansky, who's the president of the USC College Republicans. Guys, thanks very much for coming.
Thank you, Dan, for that introduction. Aaron and I would like to welcome you all to the first Road to the White House panel of the 2012 school year. As Dan mentioned, this is a weekly panel event, and we'll be holding one every Wednesday for the rest of the semester. There will always be lunch provided at 11:30, and the discussion will begin at noon. Throughout the semester, the panel will focus on different aspects of the election. We will cover topics from negative campaigning and swing voters to the hard issues of the campaign, such as the economy and healthcare. I'd like to introduce you to our panelists. To my right is Professor Schnurr, the director of the Jessie M. Unruh Institute of Politics. Professor Schnurr's record includes work on 4 presidential campaigns and 3 gubernatorial campaigns, including serving as the National Director of Communications for the 2000 presidential campaign of Senator McCain, and 5 years as the chief media spokesman for California Governor Pete Wilson. He previously served as the chairman of the California Fair Political Practices Commission and has served as the advisor to many philanthropic groups, including the William and Melinda Gates Foundation. To his right is Professor Bostic, the Judith and John Bedrosian Chair in Governments and the Public Enterprise at the Sol Price School of Public Policy here at USC. Dr. Bostic served 3 years in the Obama administration as the Assistant Secretary for Policy Development and Research at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Previously, he was the director of USC's Master of Real Estate Development degree program and was the founding director of the Kasdan Real Estate Economics Forecast. And to his right is Professor Sura, the director of the Thomas Rivera Policy Institute and the Sol Price School of Public Policy. He is also a non-resident senior fellow of the Brookings Institution, a member of the board of directors of Independent Sector, the nation's largest association of philanthropies and charities, and a trustee of the Haynes Foundation. Previously, Professor Sura founded and served as director of the Pew Hispanic Center in Washington, D.C., where he supervised the production of more than 100 publications that offered nonpartisan statistical analysis and public opinion surveys chronicling the rapid growth of the Latino population and its implications for the nation as a whole. And I would like to turn this over to Aaron Taxi to begin the discussion.
All right, so about the first half hour of this session, we're going to be asking our panelists questions to begin the conversation, but then we're going to turn to you, the audience, to pose your questions to the panelists. I'd like to ask the first question directed to the entire panel, and we'll start with Professor Schnurr. With conventions ending, what will the next 9 weeks look like for the campaigns?
It's a great question, and I hope most of you, if not all of you, have been watching the conventions, both the Republicans from Tampa last week and the Democrats in Charlotte this week. And to me, the conventions are sort of an artificial recess, if you will, in the campaign, because it provides both parties with an uninterrupted platform to deliver their messages, which is something that I think the voters benefit from hearing. But it's also sort of an artificial environment, because a campaign is a contest. It's a choice between ideas and philosophies and overall direction for government and society. And when you watch the conventions, you really don't get the sense that there's a choice at all. If you watched last week, there was only one option. It was obvious, and it was clear, and it was certainly the way to go. And this week, we're seeing the other party make it just as clear that their direction, that their alternative, is just as clear and just as obvious and just as appropriate. So once the conventions have passed and the confetti's all been swept up, then I do think you see the campaign engage in a more directed way in the choices between the two candidates and the two governing philosophies of the parties come into more clear focus. I'll offer you just one thought and then turn it over to Roberto and Raphael. But according to public opinion polling, the voters of this country have come to two fairly broad conclusions about each of the presidential candidates. And the conclusions are as follows. Voters, despite the rigors of the recession and the difficulties of the recovery, voters still like Barack Obama, and they still trust Barack Obama, and they still respect Barack Obama. But increasingly, swing voters, at least those undecided voters who are still left in the electorate, don't think he really knows what needs to be done in order to fix the economy. Mitt Romney, on the other hand, voters tend to give somewhat higher marks in terms of his knowledge of the economy. On the other hand, they don't trust him. At least they don't trust him to look out after their interests and the interests of the middle class, rather than after his own interests and those of wealthier voters. So both candidates have a real challenge. Mitt Romney has to convince voters to trust him. And for those of you who watched his speech last Thursday night, that was the overwhelming thrust of it. There wasn't a whole lot of deep dig policy, but mainly an opportunity for him to say, look, here's who I am and here's why you can rely on me. And what I suspect President Obama will do in his speech Thursday night is to take on his challenge and to say it in a level of detail, probably a greater level of detail than Romney did, for the reasons I've just stated, to say to the voters, I do know what it takes to fix this economy, and here, let me tell you what I'm going to do. And I'd say watching the two candidates as they work to overcome those two challenges, Obama's on the economy and Romney's on trust, really does frame the next 9 weeks of the campaign.
Well, I think the way I think about the next 9 weeks is in terms of the basic plotting of this campaign, which is already unusual, and I think will get more unusual. Doesn't easily fit with a lot of our precedents and the way we think about the pace of a campaign. Up until a few cycles ago, conventions typically were held in midsummer. There was a fallow period, and then the campaign started in earnest after Labor Day. And the notion was that voters started paying attention again when schools started and the weather started changing. That's all begun to, that basic plot line has begun to change as the conventions moved later and later and later. And this time they're later than they ever have been before. So it's a much more, it's a more compressed period between now and the beginning of the debates and then on to the elections. It's really, we've got about 4 weeks to the first debate, then 4 weeks of a debate season, and then a closing period of 2 or 3 weeks, which dictates a different kind of pace. There's not a lot of time to reboot at this point. I don't think either campaign really has the kind of opportunity that typically would happen after Labor Day, when you had a midsummer convention. Last time around, 2008, there were late conventions, but they were very distinctive because you had all these new characters on the scene. Sarah Palin, for one, rejuvenated the entire campaign. And it was like it all started over again after the Republican convention because of this incredibly dynamic new personality that was injected into the drama. And Obama was still somewhat new. He'd only been, since the nomination in June. So it was campaigning with Biden. There was a newness on both sides. You don't have that now. It's hard to see how either campaign really takes a big initiative. So what are you looking for that? A breakout moment. What could happen over the next 9 weeks that would change the dynamics of a campaign that up until now has been basically even? Where these two sides have traded a lot of blows already. They've spent a lot of money. If you've been in any swing states this summer, it feels like it's October already. You watch the 11 o'clock news and you'll sometimes see the same ad 2 or 3 times from a presidential campaign in July and August in places like Ohio, Virginia, Florida, and the other swing states. So a lot has already happened and there's still time. So what makes a breakout? What has done one before? In 08, it was external events. The crash on Wall Street and the economy tanking very quickly in the last 2 weeks of September. You could get external events this time as well. Probably not economic because it's not clear where that kind of crisis would come from, although on September 5th, 2008, I don't think anybody would have predicted that Lehman Brothers would no longer exist in about 15 days. But there's certainly external events in the Middle East that could upset this race. Syria is in a situation now where all kinds of things could happen. 9 weeks seems an eternity there. It could produce events that would change the landscape. And then there are the other usual things that happen. A candidate makes a big mistake. It can happen any day, any hour of any day. And in this close of a race, that could produce a breakout moment for the other candidate. And then there are the debates, which in the past have often produced breakout moments that turn a very close election in one direction or another. But that's what I'm wondering about. And as I said, it's a very compressed time frame, so that if there is one breakout moment, the chances that the losing side of that breakout will have time to recover is quite slim. I think this could be a one-event campaign where you have something decisive happens. It happened in 2008, the third week of September, between the 21st and the 28th of September. The McCain campaign tanked. And even though it recovered some before the election, it never got back to par. So I think we're looking for something like that in these 9 weeks as well.
So I guess what I would say on this question is to step back and think a bit about what each campaign thinks they need to accomplish. And to that end, I think that one of the biggest questions is who is swingable? Like who is left to convince one way or the other? And what will it take to actually convince someone to pull the lever for me or for Governor Romney versus the president? And those questions are really interesting ones, and I think they speak to some of the timing issues that you've heard from both Professor Schnurr and Professor Surup. It is remarkable. He's exactly right. If you go to a swing state, you've been barraged with ads since the spring. So the notion that this is in some way a compressed campaign, for the people in Ohio and in Wisconsin and in Florida, this campaign already seems interminable. Right, let's get to the vote. I'm tired of seeing all this stuff. And for many of those folks, they have decided one way or the other. And it's an interesting question as to what the strategy is to sort of make sure that they stay there, and to figure out how you deploy your resources most effectively. I mean, if it's the case that we've spent, millions and millions of dollars before the conventions even, in trying to establish identities and personas for the two candidates, the question is, what's the best way to use your late money? How do you coordinate that, and what kind of messaging do you put in place? There's another question which comes to my mind, which is really relevant to the nature of this series, which is how does the media take these messages, take these strategies, and translate them for the general public? There's this issue of a mistake, and it's a real, to me, it's an interesting question of what will constitute a mistake? How big a statement or error does it need to be? Or doesn't need to be an error at all? Is it just sort of something that permits some sophisticated spinning to make things look difficult? I think what you've seen in the last week or two from both campaigns is probing on this point, trying to find out what areas seem weak that might be exploitable. You've heard a lot about the welfare waivers that the administration gave in the request of several governors, some of whom were Republican governors. And then you've also heard some probing about the absence of the mention of Afghanistan at the Republican convention. Both of these are really pokes to try to start to figure out what kind of messaging and strategies we can use to really gain an advantage. And it'll be interesting to see which of those is effective and which of those is successful moving forward. And then the last thing I would say is I do think that there is actually interesting, a disconnect between where the campaigns are and where the media are. I think the media are looking for big things. They're looking for dramatic, bold statements, bold positions, colorful language and flowery things. I'm not sure that's where either campaign is at this point. And I'm not sure that's where the American public is. So it will be interesting as we go forward to see how the media intersects and interacts with these campaigns as they try to accomplish the things that they need in the next few weeks.
Well, thank you. Continuing with the discussion of messaging, Professor Suro, how are the candidates going to focus their messages and continue their narratives from the conventions?
Well, I'm not sure if I can, it's hard to guess how they will, in part because the narratives have been so slim. I mean, from my point of view, this is an interesting election. Another one of the ways that it's anomalous is the absence of really strong narratives. Part of this is due to the fact that both the candidates are fairly familiar. One of them, the president, has told his story over and over again so many times that a lot of people can recite episodes by heart from his childhood. And the other, Governor Romney, has really resisted, up until recently, creating a personal narrative. And so you don't have, neither party so far, neither candidate so far, has laid out a narrative for the future either. So you don't have personal narratives, you don't have these game plan narratives. We were talking before, I'm stepping on Dan's line, but I mean, the president has got his chance to lay out his narrative tomorrow night, and presumably that's what he's going to do in terms of giving some kind of a vision of where you go forward. And it can be lame, but it's got to be something. I remember Bill Clinton in 1996, who we think of now as this great orator. His vision for the second term was the bridge to the 21st century, which was as lame then as it sounds now. But so far, you don't have big narrative building. There's been a very, you have negative campaigning that attacks the other person. And you've got very high negatives on both sides. But one of the reasons why the media is genuinely upset, news organizations, reporters are now in public complaining about this campaign in a very unseemly fashion, in my mind, but that's another story. Because of the lack of narratives, the lack of really good stories. There isn't a Sarah Palin here. There aren't any great characters. And there aren't any great plot lines. So the campaigns are going to have to create one out of abstractions, out of policies, which is much harder to do than trying to create one out of personalities. And they're going to have to, I'll just add one other thought to this. Going into these conventions, you might have thought that the Republicans were going to do a mass media campaign because they had so much money, and still have so much money between the campaign and the super PACs, that you're going to have a messaging apparatus that's dominated by one-to-many mass media strategies. And that the Obama campaign, the other conventional wisdom, was creating this grassroots organization, highly networked, great use of social media. And I sort of thought we were in this classic battle of old mass media and new social media. I don't think it's playing out that way. Disappointingly, for what I thought was would have been a great little analysis of this campaign, because the Republicans did not master a mass media narrative, I thought, out of their convention. The messaging was surprisingly sloppy. The TV was surprisingly sloppy. And the Democrats seem to be going for a big show. And they're spending a lot of money on ads as well. So anyway, I didn't answer the question. But you knew that.
Well,
I'll try to answer that. So I actually think that there are really two issues on this. The first is what each might want a narrative to be. And in thinking about that, I think you have to go back to where the folks were even 18 months from now, when the Republican collective, I think, was pretty convinced that they could run as I'm not Obama, and that's good enough, right? And I think they have been, to some extent, surprised at the proactive approach that the Obama campaign has taken to try to define the other side, to define the Republicans as something other than not Obama. And that has led to, I think, some consternation in Republican circles, which they are starting to coalesce around. I thought that the convention was actually, short of the Eastwood thing, which was bizarre, was actually pretty well focused on trying to stick to a message of the economy and not all these social issues. And that's something that they're going to really try to do. But I do think that, and I think that Governor Romney's speech was really a way to emphasize that the I'm not him means that I am someone as well, and I have to talk about that as important, and that will be important. For the Obama campaign, I think what we have seen is an extreme sensitivity to the past and to the history and the context for which he governed. And so if you saw, or you've seen any of the back and forth about Paul Ryan's characterizations about what happened in 2008 and 2009, in most instances, those are third order, fourth order issues in a campaign. In this instance, it's critical because it sets the backdrop against which you assess the president's performance. And so what we're going to see, I think, from the Democratic side is really a statement of, in order to assess me, you have to remember where we were and remember how things were, and then try to craft some articulation about what the right metric is and something that's credible. That is extremely difficult, right? And it's going to be very hard to do, but I think that that's really the approach that the campaign will take in terms of its messaging moving forward.
Well, one last question before we turn over to our audience, and this one is for you, Professor Schnurr. While both parties have been previously trying to define their opponents, now redefining themselves, a lot of people forget that after Election Day, things go on. And I'm wondering how this election will define the future of both parties.
Well, another great question. And I think one of the things that any presidential candidate, and certainly any president, thinks about is not just his or in the near future her administration, but their legacy also, how they've changed the overall direction and identity of their party. And the truth is, and Roberto made this point a little bit earlier, so I'll steal a point back from him, is that for all sorts of reasons in a multimedia era, it's a lot harder for presidential candidates, or presidents for that matter, to put a stamp on their party. There was no evidence whatsoever of George W. Bush or George H.W. Bush or anyone else named Bush except for Jeb Bush at the Republican convention last week. The Democratic Party, and Raphael can talk to this probably more authoritatively than I, has very dramatically changed its trajectory in the 12 years since Bill Clinton left office. So I don't know that there is going to be an Obama brand of the democratism or a Romney brand of republicanism beyond their own administration. But just a couple quick points to wrap up what Roberto and Raphael were talking about, if that's okay. Raphael makes a really good point. The Romney people decided early this year that they could elect their guy as president because he wasn't Barack Obama. And the economy was bad and people were unhappy, so being un-Obama was good enough. I think they realized late summer that that was not good enough, and had they made their vice presidential selection a little bit earlier in the summer, you probably would have seen someone like Senator Portman or Governor Pawlenty as the choice, because that was a vice presidential running mate who wouldn't have had a pronounced impact on the campaign. And if you're going to be un-Obama, you don't want to do anything to create some waves. And the selection of Ryan was I'd say an uncharacteristically bold decision on Romney's part, whether you agree with it or not, to make the campaign about something other than Obama versus un-Obama, enforcing a conversation about entitlements and Medicare and other related issues. As far as the narrative, because I think they got a better question than I did, Aaron, so I'm going to answer theirs too. A couple of things to keep in mind as far as the overwhelming narrative of the campaign. One we talked about a little bit earlier. Barack Obama and his advisors look at poll numbers and realize that voters respect him, but they don't think he knows how to fix things yet. So part of his narrative is, yes, I do, and here's how I'm going to fix these things. And Romney's people look at those same polls and realize that people do think he understands the economy, but think he's going to look out for the interests of the rich rather than those of the middle class. And what you saw last Thursday in Tampa was Romney's first effort, and potentially belated effort, to establish an emotional connection with the voters, saying, hey, I'm not this rich, mean guy that the Obama people are telling you about. Here's who I really am. One of the narrative to keep in mind going forward, and I think we tend to lose sight of this, not just us on the panels, but anybody who follows the election close enough to come to a lunch like this one for anything other than the free lunch, is this election, I'd say for the first time in many years, really does have a very distinct and very overarching set of choices. And it's a fundamental disagreement between Romney and Obama about how large or how small a role government should play in a nation's economy, particularly during a time of economic difficulty. Think of it as a campaign between Bain and Solyndra. And Romney and Obama are sort of helpful proxies for those two philosophies of government. If you think what Mitt Romney did at Bain was good, think he created wealth, created jobs, he showed how the private sector worked, then you're probably a Romney supporter. If you think his time at Bain represented not the best but the worst of American capitalism, and you think it represented opportunities for the wealthy to get wealthier at the expense of the working class, then you're predisposed against him. If you think that the Obama administration's investment in the Solyndra factory up in Northern California was a sign of government overreach and government meddling, well, then you're probably leaning Romney. If you think it was an example that represents a broader approach of fostering a new economy, alternative energies, green technology, a different economy for a new century, you say, look, that one decision went bad, but that broader approach is what it takes for the future. So this Bain versus Solyndra overarching philosophical argument, I think, is a really important one. And I think one of the reasons we tend to overlook it in this campaign is because neither Romney nor Obama, I would argue, is sufficiently confident in their own argument, or at least they're not confident in their ability to sell the voters on their own argument, that in addition to arguing their own economic philosophy, they devoted a disproportionate amount of time to explaining to you why the other guy is such a menace. So as you watch the campaign go forward, in between the negative ads and the finger pointing and the name calling, there is a narrative there if the candidates are willing to get out of the way and let us see it.
Could I add just one quick thought to the original question, which about thinking about 2013. I would just ask you to keep attention to the down ballot races, because what happens in the election of the House of Representatives and the Senate will have more to do, I think, with how the nation's governed after 2013 than who gets elected president. Particularly if the Republicans win a clear, a cloture-proof majority in the Senate, if they increase their gains in the House, that's where the governance will happen in this country. It will happen on the Hill, regardless of who's president.
Well, that's great, Roberto. So we're going to have to rename our lunch series from Road to the White House to Road to Capitol Hill. Thanks very
Road
much.
to Washington, anyway. I actually would urge you to reprint all the signs.
All right, guys, we're going to reprint all the banners.
All right, well, it's now time for all of you to contribute to our conversation. 2 notes. The first one is our experts, Maddie and myself, would like to know who you are. So if you could say your name, your year, and your major, that would be most wonderful. Second is, while a lot of opinions were shared on this panel that you might have disagreed with, we'd like to remind you that your opponent is not your enemy. And we hope that you engage with our experts with the same respect that they engage with each other. So with that in mind, feel free to raise your hand and we'll call on you for a question.
I'm Nathaniel Hawes. I'm a freshman. I'm studying political science and economics. And my question is, going into the debate season, which candidate do you think has a better advantage and will better exploit that advantage in the debates to, get ahead of the polls and better the election?
My own opinion, and for those of you who didn't hear it, it's a very good question about the debates and which candidate is better positioned to do well in those debates. Generally speaking, I think debates are overrated. I mean, they're valuable exercises, not only for us to hear the candidates talk about their own issue agendas, as I was talking about earlier, as they do in the conventions, but to see how they react to unanticipated circumstances. I want to know how a man or woman thinks on their feet if they're going to be leading the country and leading the free world. But going back to a point Roberto made earlier about the so-called gaffe watch, the media looking for a mistake. In this era, the only way a candidate tends to be judged as a winner in a debate is if their opponent does something really stupid. Romney and Obama are both smart people. If one of them happens to make a verbal slip-up, well, that's going to get way too much attention. I don't know that it's going to fundamentally alter the overall trajectory of the race. One thing I'll offer you from having watched the primary debates, as I know many of you did, Romney, and this is not a unique thought because any of the number of people who've profiled him have said this, Romney is very comfortable and very effective playing by a preset set of rules. And when someone breaks those rules, he tends to get less comfortable. If you remember at one point during one of the primary debates, he turned to Anderson Cooper, the moderator, and said, "Anderson, that's not fair, stop that." And if I were doing the debate coaching for Barack Obama before the debate, in addition to making sure that he's up to speed on the policy matters that are going to be discussed, I would be plotting some way to throw Mitt Romney off his game. Do something that Romney's not expecting, because when he knows how, when he's dealing with things that are expected, he's very effective and very articulate and very intelligent, but he doesn't handle those unexpected circumstances nearly as well. And I don't know quite what it is that Obama does, but it is something less substantive than stylistic that gets Romney discombobulated, and people like us spend way too much time talking about it on the news the next day.
So I actually think that's right. I also think that Romney actually has some real opportunities through these debates to articulate a bit more about where he is and what he stands for. There's an overarching, I'm going to say the word cloud, I'm not sure if people would say that, but there's a disconnect between his governing time in Massachusetts and the Republican platform and a lot of what he said in the course of the campaign. And I think people are sensitive and looking for reassurance, either one way or the other, about what his positions are and what he's likely to do. And so Romney will have an opportunity through these debates to really bolster his own self-definition, if you will, and that can be helpful. I do think that you know, the goal of all these debates is just not to mess up, right? Try to stay as close to the vest as possible, and really not give fodder for the others. And the one thing that was striking for me through the Republican series of debates, I was shocked they had that many. That was just so much material that's put out there. And it was really interesting to me how many extreme statements were out there. I thought actually Romney did pretty well through most of them. You know, there were a lot of shenanigans going on in those debates, and he weathered it fine. I think as the pressure goes up, it will be interesting to see how both candidates deal with it, because I think even the president in his first round, I think he felt fairly secure. It was after a lot of the Wall Street stuff had happened, and that he could really not have to do very much. I'm not sure he's thinking that right now.
I think those lay out the land very well. The only thing I would also highlight is that the first debate is going to be in a new format, with fewer questions and longer answers and more opportunities for back and forth. So both candidates are going to be facing something they haven't seen, at least in a debate format. I don't think that Romney's experience in the Republican debates is terribly good preparation for what he's going to see now, because they were multi-party, multi-candidate forums, and he basically let everybody else self-destruct. You know, I mean, he really didn't have to do that much given the nature of his opponents, because there was always somebody going after somebody else. And in a these I think will have a very different tone and very different requirements of him than those did. But you know, they'll rehearse to death, and then it's, as Dan said, it's a matter of whether something unexpected happens and somebody goes off script.
Real quick, and I know we want to work in as many questions as possible, I just want to give you guys an example of something unexpected, not substantive, but in terms of the dynamic between the candidates. If you want to go back on YouTube and look at past presidential debates, I'd encourage you to go back and look at a couple. All the way back in 1996, Bill Clinton and Bob Dole are debating. And Clinton had a wireless microphone. And he wandered the stage. He would walk over to one edge of the stage, talk to people over here, walk over to one edge of the stage and talk to people over there. And it drove Bob Dole crazy. Because Bob Dole had been debating for 195 years, and when you debated, you stand at the podium and you face your opponent, and then you go on to the next. And every time Clinton would be answering a question from a different part of the stage, you just saw, you know, it was like watching Wile E. Coyote trying to figure out where Roadrunner was. So fast forward 4 years, and Al Gore decides he's going to do the same thing to discombobulate George Bush. And Gore is, we'll say, just not quite as adroit at this kind of thing as Clinton was. Few people are. And there's a great scene, if you find it on YouTube, of Bush answering a question, Gore leaving his podium and going and standing behind Bush and standing sort of ramrod straight. The analyst said the next day it looked like something out of Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Bush was giving his answer and talking about whatever he was talking about, and he realized that Gore wasn't at his podium anymore, but he was over his shoulder. So Bush is talking and answering the question, and he looks over at Gore and just sort of nods like, okay, I'll be with you in a second, and gets back to his answer. Bob Dole handled something unexpected badly, and it threw him off his game. George Bush rolled with it and ended up having a more straightforward debate. That's not prescribing Barack Obama to wander around the stage, but my point being, and Roberto nailed it, is being one candidate on a debate stage with 10 other people, isn't that hard? It's like playing musical chairs. You just keep your eye on a chair and you grab it, and as long as you don't get eliminated, you're just fine. One-on-one is tougher. And if Obama does something to try to throw Romney off his game, it'll be interesting to see how Romney does respond. Sorry to double down.
Yes, in the red shirt.
All right, I'm Adrienne Masani. I'm a freshman. I'm a Claire Freeman student. My question for you is, what role do you anticipate that foreign policies were to play in this upcoming campaign? Because you hear a lot about the economy from Romney, you hear a lot about social issues and women's issues and healthcare from Obama, but what do you think about foreign policy?
Policy Institute guy?
Sure, I'll be the policy guy. I actually think foreign policy is funny all the time, because as much as we believe that national defense and those sorts of issues are important for the federal government to do, those don't touch the average American household on a daily basis. And so it's not always clear, when you prioritize how much emphasis someone is putting on foreign policy when they go into the ballot box. What was interesting in this campaign is I think there's a general consensus that the president is pretty strong in terms of his foreign policy positions. His performance has, I think, exceeded what people expected, and he's delivered on a lot of things that some would have had skepticism on, which has, to some extent, defanged one of the standard approaches or critiques of Democratic candidates, which is they're going to be weak on defense and make America weaker than stronger. Now, we're still going to see some of that debate, but to the extent that that's going to move the electorate, I don't think we're going to see very much in that regard. The only thing that I would say might shake that up, and Roberto talked about this, is if something were to happen in the interim 9 weeks, and the president's response to that, and then whether it really leads to a galvanizing behind the president, that's a possibility. But there's a lot of uncertainty there that we're not going to be able to predict. But I in general don't think that this is going to be won or lost on a foreign policy issue.
I'll take a slightly different tack. I think that debate has the potential to produce a breakout moment in a couple of different ways. It's going to pose a different kind of challenge to Romney, who really has not campaigned on foreign policy much at all. And a lot of his domestic appeal is based on a claim that I've actually done this. I have created jobs. I know how to do this. I'm hands-on. I have the experience. He doesn't. He's never run a business. And this is one of the very clear contrasts he's been able to draw. When it comes to foreign policy, Romney has nothing to fall back on, nothing to talk about in terms of that's experiential. He has no personal narratives, no stories to tell. And Obama has learned a lot about foreign policy. I mean, he's done a lot. He's run 2-3 wars, depending on how you count them, and has overseen a lot of foreign policy. So it's going to be the difference, potentially the asymmetry between the two candidates, I think is going to be stark in that debate, in a way that's the opposite of how Romney's going to want it to be on domestic policy, where he's going to say, I'm the one who knows how to do this, you flubbed. On foreign policy, it's going to be quite a different dynamic. And it's also this, if I'm not mistaken, that debate is in mid-October, maybe late October, right? That's the Martha Raddatz debate? So it's like the 17th or 18th of October. It's very late. And foreign policy doesn't lend itself to slogans, which is basically what Romney is about as far as he's gone on foreign policy so far. I mean, saying the president threw Israel under the bus is a great one-liner. If you have to explain that for 10 minutes with somebody questioning you back, it's harder. It's also going to be harder for Obama to say, look, it's more complicated than that. Trust me, I've been there. You don't understand this stuff because it's too complicated. So I think that could be one of the places where you get a rawer kind of juxtaposition between the two candidates than on what's going to be very highly tilled land already in terms of domestic policy.
Yeah, I agree with a great deal of what Roberto and Rafael said. I disagree with one point. I don't know that personal experience on foreign policy is a necessary prerequisite for the voters to take you seriously, if only because Barack Obama, George W. Bush, Bill Clinton, Ronald Reagan, and Jimmy Carter were all elected president without any hands-on foreign policy experience. So I don't know that Romney's lack of personal experience in that arena causes him any problems. That said, and for those of you who attended our panel discussion last Thursday night after Romney's speech, you heard me talk about it then. This will be the first presidential, Barack Obama is the first Democratic presidential candidate since John F. Kennedy who does not face a disadvantage going into the election on issues relating to national security and foreign policy, simply because Osama bin Laden and Gaddafi are both dead, and the war in Iraq is over, and the American people are no longer paying attention to the wind down of the war in Afghanistan. This is an election about the economy, and that doesn't mean that foreign policy issues are not important, but in a recession or in an economy struggling to come out of recession, the economy comes first, second, and third. So if you are the challenger, if you're Mitt Romney, every day that the conversation is about the economy is a good day. Every day it's about something else is a good day for Barack Obama. And as you noted in your question, his efforts and the Democratic Convention's efforts to change the conversation to health care and other social and cultural issues reflects that. In the debate, my guess is, and I have no idea how the Romney people are preparing for that debate, my guess is because the economy is such a seminal issue, and because Romney does not have the hands-on experience, as Roberto mentioned, he spends a lot of time in that debate talking about foreign policy in an economic context, talking about foreign trade, talking about exports, talking about a global marketplace, and using his business experience as a way to leverage that, which is important, but probably not as exciting as talking about Osama bin Laden.
I would just add, one thing though about Romney, which is not about what experience he can present as a credential. It's a matter of his self-confidence to me on this subject matter, and whether in 45 minutes in, it's in foreign policy that he stumbles because it's not his home turf. It's psychological.
Again, I think that's a similar point that you could make for Obama and Bush and Clinton and Carter and Reagan. Real quick on the Middle East. There's no way to guess, of course, what's going to happen in Syria, but I would be very, very surprised, and I'm not an international expert, but from everything I've read and smarter people than me who I've talked to, which is, well, everybody, the smart people I talked to on Middle Eastern policy have convinced me to believe that the likelihood of Israel launching a military action against Iran before the election is very, very small. Earlier this year, there was thought that Netanyahu might believe that launching that attack pre-election would be to his benefit because the pressure on Obama to support it would be much, much greater. I've come to believe that Netanyahu is savvy enough politically that he realizes that injecting that issue into an American presidential campaign probably doesn't do him a whole lot of good in the long run, either with the American people or the next American president, be it Obama or Romney. That's not to say that there can't be an unexpected circumstance in the Middle East or elsewhere, as Roberto and Raphael were talking about, but I don't think Benjamin Netanyahu is the one who would instigate it.
The much more likely one is a bloodbath in Syria, which is so grotesque that the United States, the West, some conglomeration of countries feel obliged to do something. I mean, where you get pictures that cannot be ignored. That could happen any minute.
That's right.
And put the president, NATO, the Security Council, everybody, Putin, the whole shebang on a spot where people have to do something to stop the killing.
All right, we're going to go with right over here, and we're almost out of time, so this will be our last question for the afternoon.
Hi, my name is Tanya, and I'm a third-year public policy and law major over at Full Price. And Professor Schnur, you talked about this sort of false environment that the conventions sort of fabricate, and I personally see them as like giant pep rallies for political parties. And I was just wondering, as far as people who consider themselves less partisan or maybe swing voters, which convention would you say did a better job at convincing this electorate to vote a particular way?
The question, for those of you who didn't hear it, which is which convention did a better job of convincing swing voters to support their party? And I think it's difficult to answer that question for another 36 hours until the Democrats get to finish. But I think the premise of the question is an important one, whether you call them pep rallies or infomercials. One thing that Jeff Cowan and Jeff Ballman I saw in Charlotte this last weekend was a great point that Matt Bai, the New York Times Magazine reporter, made, talking about Clint Eastwood's appearance. Regardless of whether you thought it was good, bad, or indifferent, he predicted, I think correctly, that it was the last unscripted moment you will ever see in a national political campaign. Both parties will never, ever let anyone get on stage again without every word and every syllable and every punctuation mark approved in advance. So my answer to that, and I've got 4 years to make it happen, so if anyone wants to help, let me know. I've decided that the best way to make the conventions relevant again in that kind of persuasive context, as opposed to just rallying the bases of the two parties, is instead of holding the conventions sequentially, one after the other, hold them simultaneously. Hold them at the same time. Say for 1 week, the Republicans are going to go to one city, the Democrats are going to go to the other, and they're going to put on their best show. And if the other party says something that you think needs responding to, well, then you drop your pre-scripted message and you respond to them. And if Marco Rubio has to respond to what Julian Castro says, and if Michelle Obama has to respond to what Ann Romney said, let them go back and forth from their respective cities, from their respective conventions, and let the media cover not just an over-idealized, in a vacuum party, one-way party discussion, but let them judge the two parties on their merits, engaging in discussion and debate.
So you want this to be WWE, huh?
Absolutely. I think it can be done respectfully and with honor. But before,
Wait a minute.
before we go on, though, just because these guys are going to want to weigh in, at the very beginning we talked about how these programs are sponsored cooperatively by the Under-Instituted Politics, by the Bedrosian Center, and by the Center for Communications Leadership over at Annenberg. And while Roberto has very graciously agreed to join us today as a representative of the Center for Communication Leadership, their chairman and their director, Jeff Cowan and Jeff Baum, are both here today. They've been instrumental in putting this program series together. And even though neither Jeff is on the panel, we want to thank you guys for your time and your support. So thank you very much.
All right. Well, unless our other panelists have a quick word on that question, that will wrap it up for this afternoon. First of all, let's give another round of applause for our experts. Also, thank you to my co-moderator, Maddie Lansky, the president of the College Republicans. Oh, thank you. And of course, thank you to all of you for participating and engaging in this discussion. A couple dates to keep in mind. Tomorrow evening, President Barack Obama will be accepting the nomination of the Democratic Party, and the Under-Institute will be holding a viewing of this speech tomorrow, September 6th at 7 p.m. In the Annenberg East lobby. Dinner will be served beforehand. Additionally, next week, the Road to the White House discussion continues, and it will be hosted by the Under-Institute of Politics. The subject will be the key issues: jobs, healthcare, and Medicare. And it will take place, once again, 12 p.m. Next week, next Wednesday, in the Rosen Family Screening Room, which is RTCC, Ronald Tudor Campus Center, 227. One last note is, if you are still looking for a political or government internship in this campaign season, please visit the Under-Institute. Their office is in BKC 263, and they can definitely help you out. They've helped both of us out. So.
And finally, let's thank both Aaron Taxi and Maddie Lansky for a terrific job of moderating today's discussion. We'll look forward to seeing you at Annenberg tomorrow night at 7 o'clock for the President's speech and a post-speech discussion, and next Wednesday back here in the Student Center for the next in our Road to the White House lunches.